welcome. I'm Mark Ziberaback, a political columnist for the Los Angeles Times, here to talk about California's gubernatorial recall election now in its home stretch. I'm joined by 5 of my fabulous LA Times colleagues. Before I introduce them, however, a bit of perspective. In the whole history of these United States, there have been 4 gubernatorial recall elections. As it happens, 2 of them have taken place here in California within the last 20 years. Now, polls suggest that our current governor, the Democrat Gavin Newsom, is more likely than not to beat the recall, but as the old cliche goes, polls don't vote, people do. We're not going to try and make any predictions, but what we can do is talk about how we got to this point and where California is likely to go, whatever happens on Tuesday. And with that, let me introduce you to our panelists, starting with columnist Erica Smith. Erica covers California with a particular emphasis on the diversity of people and places that make this state the rich tapestry that we all know and love. In Sacramento, Taryn Luna, Phil Willon, they cover Gavin Newsom and have been covering this recall from the get-go. And lastly, from our illustrious Metro staff, we have Faith Pinu and Julia Wick. They have been traveling hither and yon all over the campaign trail, covering the action, the rough, the tumble. I'm going to start with you, Phil. It's your lucky day. We don't have to go back that far. November 2018, Gavin Newsom elected in a landslide. Stomps, wallops, whoops. The Republican John Cox, who happens to be one of those running again to replace him. How did we get from there to this point, Phil?
Well, it's been a long, crazy, wild ride. I mean, since almost the day Gavin Newsom stepped into office, attempts have been launched to try to recall him from office. So basically, I think this one is now the 6th. And I guess the most effective, obviously. But when this began, which was in the early 2020, it was an afterthought. It was something like a faint honk in the night, barely noticeable. No one really thought it had a chance. So anyway, the recall drive just kind of languished for months. They were gathering signatures as best they could, and lo and behold, the pandemic hit, and that did a couple things. One is that it gave them another issue to kind of build on. The pandemic and the COVID response wasn't even part of the initial recall petition. But as Californians got more, I guess, started to chafe a little bit more about all the restrictions, about the stay-at-home orders, about their kids not being in school, more animosity started to build among the electorate. And it wasn't really just Republicans or Trump supporters. It was a kind of more the California electorate, some Democrats, moderates. And then in November, a year ago almost, a judge in Sacramento, because of all the restrictions imposed by the pandemic, including stay-at-home orders, gave the petition, the recall proponents, 4 or 5 more months to gather signatures. That put them over the edge. It qualified in April, and here we are.
I want to turn to Faith and ask you, Phil touched on this, and you certainly hear Gavin Newsom and his allies, they keep talking about the Republican recall. This is an attempt by Republicans to steal away an office they couldn't win under normal circumstances. So what's animating? Who's behind this recall? And is there anything to that assertion that this is a Republican power grab, quote unquote?
There is certainly a concentrated number of Republicans who are excited about this recall, and they might be the people who put this over the edge. But the recall effort was really started by these 3 political novices. They're Orrin Heatley, who is a former sheriff sergeant, Mike Netter, who is a realtor, and Randy Economy, who was at one point a journalist. And they started this effort. They are Republicans, but they crisscrossed the state gathering support for this. And as Phil said, a lot of people were upset about how the pandemic was run by the state administration, and they took out their anger on Newsom. And that runs the gamut from the most conservative Republicans in the northeastern corner of the state, where like President Trump got the most support, to Democrats in Los Angeles. So there were people really from across the spectrum supporting this. Of course, Gavin Newsom and his campaign are trying to paint everyone as Trump Republicans, which is certainly true for a section of the electorate, but there are people from all stripes supporting this effort.
Taryn, we've gotten this far without really discussing the pandemic, and COVID, I think we'd agree, overshadows everything. So how has this pandemic, how has some of the actions Gavin Newsom has taken, has not taken, has angered people by taking, how has COVID and the pandemic played into all this?
I mean, I think we all saw last spring when he did the stay-at-home orders. I think by May, we had massive protests in places like Orange County and a lot of pushback on that throughout the pandemic. But, now in hindsight, looking back, he polls pretty well in terms of how he handled it, particularly among Democrats. And I think another interesting thing to note is his approval ratings have also remained pretty high throughout this, above 50%. Before the French Laundry situation, he was higher at like 64%, and they dropped. But even throughout this, whether, going through a pandemic, ordering people to stay home, doing business restrictions, he's weathered that pretty well in terms of his popularity.
Erica, Phil talked about how a lot of the issues in this recall have been litigated. As you know, as a lot of our viewers probably know, California has a very long history of what I'll call grievance-driven politics. Some of this old, some of this new, but here we are.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily, I think we've all kind of mentioned that so much of the roots of this recall these aren't new issues. And I think it was Phil or Taryn talked about and Faith talked about some of the issues out of the far north. I mean, one of those I would add to that is forest management, which we've seen a lot lately with the Dixie Fire and the Caldor Fire, and people being very upset about, with Democrats. But I think it also just goes to this broader idea that there's a lot of more conservative leading voters in the state that feel that the Democratic majority has basically not only just neglected their interests, but actively is trying to ruin their way of life, I guess, whatever, quote unquote. So I think that there's just a lot of anger that's out there. And I think that it's behind that. And I do agree that the pandemic just gave people a venue for that. And it, all of these other grievances kind of got, sucked all the air out of the room with COVID. It became about mask mandates and vaccine mandates and, businesses being closed. And that became the big driver. But of course, the irony is that now most of the electorate is actually kind of approving of the way that Governor Newsom has handled most of this, even if they're not exactly thrilled the way everything went down. I think that we can look today at the rates of vaccination and the rates of hospitalization in here in California, compare it to Texas or compare it to Florida, where governors there are still, kind of walking the talk that a lot of the recall supporters would have us do. And you see that's happening there. So it is kind of this very interesting mixture of kind of like pick your grievance. And that's why I want to recall Gavin Newsom.
Yeah. Julia Toofer, if I may, you pick up your ballot. Everyone in California was mailed one. Every voter in California was mailed one. 46 names on the ballot. Talk about that. And then notably, no top shelf, well-known Democrat running. In contrast to 2003, the Lieutenant Governor Cruz Bustamante ran on the no on the recall, but yes on Bustamante. We don't have that dynamic this time. So talk a bit about the absence of a big name Democrat and some of the other folks on the ballot.
Absolutely. So I'll start with the second part of your question, which is why there isn't any well-known Democrat on your ballot. That was considered a real victory for the Newsom camp that no prominent Democrat got into the race. Their kind of thinking, they really discouraged anyone from getting in, was that if there was a prominent Democrat on that list, it would legitimize the recall effort, but also there are, voters who might be willing to vote yes on recall who wouldn't otherwise be willing to do so if there was a candidate they liked on that list. So there are 6 Democrats running. The most well-known is Kevin Paffrath, I think 28 or 29-year-old YouTuber who has no elected office experience. And there really isn't anyone who most Democrats consider to be a viable candidate.
And worth noting, last time we had 135 candidates, this time 46. And any speculation from anyone on why we didn't hit that number this time around?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
2 things I've heard. One is that tax returns were required. Those then actually ended up not being required after the filing deadline due to a lawsuit, but they were when people filed. And so experts say that probably discouraged some people. And it was also a much shorter turnaround time that people had to really go and get. You need something like 65 to 100 and something signatures, and far more if you want to get a discount on your filing fee.